I'm incredibly optimistic about this ecosystem. There's a lot of macro stuff that is really pushing us along that I don't think we could have imagined 5 years ago. Some of it is geopolitical, but in terms of like what we as an ecosystem can do to help move it along further, I think there's this sort of notion around like information exchange, community building, helping each other, I think is really important. Would want to encourage people to do that, to connect more, create more moments of this serendipity, and then we can all prosper together.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 20,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Say hello to Basket, transforming Indonesia's supply chains and redefining what's possible in commerce. Basket sees the untapped potential in over 200,000 distributors and wholesalers. This startup merges tradition with innovation, technology, and financial support. They are not looking to disrupt, they are here to collaborate. The results are modernized operations, streamlined supply chains, and a win-win for manufacturers and consumers alike. Learn more at www.basket.app. Morning, Shiyan.
Good morning, Jeremy. Happy National Day to you.
How was your National Day? We watched TV on my end. It was the first time they ever held fireworks. And well, not the first time, but it was the first time at the fireworks that was not at the main location. We always watched it on TV, but at the satellite location, it was like in the stadium. It was packed. It was great. Patriotism was high. And the fireworks were awesome. And it was our kids' first ever National Day in person, but also first ever fireworks ever. So the two, had a nice video recording of a 3-year-old and 1-year-old, their first ever experience.
I love it. I love
fireworks.
it. We had some people over, casual potluck, chicken curry, bihun type of setup. And then we put the live
Local food.
stream up on TV for everyone to kind of like watch what was going on. And I thought what was fun was we had a ton of PRs in the room, but only 2 citizens. Yours truly is one of them. And everyone was like, I've lived here for 10 plus years and I've never seen this before. Like I've never seen a National Day parade. And I was like, how is this possible? It was so, they were watching it and they're like, what is total defense? And then there was like that little skit with the kid or whatever. It was like a little bit cringe. And they were like, what is total defense? And like the whole thing comes out and they were, surprised by the military vehicles coming through. And also I hadn't realized, did you notice that flag parade had corporations in it?
I wasn't paying that close attention enough. There was a trends part. So I might have missed it, but I did see the total defense one. And my favorite part was the cyber defense because, you show like scams, phishing, malware. And I was like, yes, all the techie side of me is like, yes, please prevent scams from happening. And
it was actually really good. And I think, I don't know, I'm always mixed, like a part of me, I'm like, this is so cringy, but I'm like, actually, these are important topics. Like, what does it mean to be like economic defense, social defense? How do we like work together on these fronts? And so I think I come out on the side of like positive, even though sometimes when you're watching it, you're like,
I mean, every country's Independence Day is not a time subtlety, right? I'm just saying, like, it's not as if like July 4th is not like full out America, with the beer, the flags. The fireworks.
Totally.
Yeah, it's every Independence Day is always on the nose, right? I mean, French have, for example, they have Bastille Day, right? I mean, a big day. They also have a military parade, very common for them. And they actually have contingents from other countries who are participating there.
That's
interesting.
Bastille Day? I had no idea.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think it's a very common aspect, I think.
Yeah. And then the kids, we had all these P1 kids who obviously have learned all the songs. And so they were like dancing and singing in front of the TV. And the parents were just like, wow, the brainwashing starts young. And I'm like, you have the rest of your life to be cynical. You should just lean into this. Enjoy it while you can.
That reminded me that we did have, our kindergarten did have a National Day performance. And so that was my first ever performance was, I mean, let's say my kid debut performance does not give me high hopes for her to be a Broadway performer one day. But she crushed it, I think, enthusiasm and very cuteness. But let's just say that, 3 years old is not really the star time, I think, to show your case. I think she was just holding like a bunch of like rods of, those confetti. And I have no idea what those are. And then she was doing the song song called Bicycle. And anyway, I loved it.
Of
I don't
course.
care. It was very on the nose
It
for
was
me.
pitched
It
for
was
you to love.
100% about
Yeah, it
bicycle.
was 100%
Yeah, it
for
was.
parents to feel like
Yeah,
they're spending good money at this kindergarten.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I don't wanna
exactly.
say it, but my child is obviously cuter than all the other children. That's the feeling it should evoke in you.
I agree to disagree. So anyway, the rest of the kindergarten, it was basically like also had total defense. So you had little firefighters, the
Oh my god, so
policemen.
cute.
And I was like, oh boy, this is so cute. Anyway, so I was like, okay, well, it's total defense. But it did remind me that when I was in the military, I think one thing they always, when you're 18-year-old going through this military service, everybody's telling you about why you had to defend the country. Like, there's a lot of like terminology. And then I always remember that the instructors, they were trying to motivate us, and then they were like, "Oh, they're here to take your land. They're here to take your women." To be honest, is what they said. And then I was like, you know what? This is probably like the most elemental part of this entire military thing. Like, forget all the like terminology and all
Yeah,
that
they're here
stuff,
to take
right?
your stuff. They're here to
You're here to take your
kill your
stuff. That's
family.
why you got to defend the country.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was like, that's like, anyway. But I thought the reason why was like I was watching this like kindergarten performance and all these kids and all these parents. And then I was watching my cute kids, and I was like, "Oh my god, I would do anything to protect my kids, right?" And I was thinking to myself, like, "Man, nobody wants us to piss off this kindergarten because I'm saying like this is like 100 parents that will like 100% like kill to defend their kids, right?" And I mean, it was just an interesting moment where it kind of like clicked for me, where I was like watching this. To some extent, they always call it what Mama Bear, right? Papa Bear, right? Which is like people becoming very defensive of their family. I think there's a big part of like aspects. So it's
Yeah, you
interesting.
need to have
I mean,
something
obviously,
worth defending, right? So whether
I
it's
agree.
your house or your family, why do you think we
Yeah,
encourage people to buy houses and procreate? It's
yeah.
all part of the plan, Jeremy.
Oh, part of the plan. There we go. I know as an 18-year-old, you have neither, right? You have no money, no property, and no family. So you're just like, oh, okay, I'm here. What am I doing? Awesome to hear about all the various national days that are out there. I think what's interesting in terms of regional news, I think we were sharing a couple of them. One of them that you shared was about the upcoming US Biden administration on venture capital investments in China. Stuff you want to share about that?
Well, I think it's just a progression of some of the work that we've talked about before, but it's an additional executive order limiting VC investments into Chinese semiconductors, quantum computing,
Right.
and certain artificial intelligence applications. For the past 30 years, the US has been
Yeah.
investing heavily into China. It's like a second largest economy in the world, diversification, growth. And even though it is sort of a narrow set of restrictions, I do think it casts a chill over investing in China more broadly. And it really makes people think about the perception of investing in the enemy, even if that's not actually what's happening. And I think the way the US always gets you is on reporting requirements, which you have to think about like, hey, even if I'm doing something totally legitimate, the fact that I report all this stuff, this kind of admin burden, is it worth it? Should I do it? So I think this is just like another nail in the coffin, another step down the road. I don't know what the right analogy is here.
Yeah, I think you're right to say that it is a progression, right? And I think that story that it picks of that and what's been announced every kind of like, I'll say every half a good sign from my perspective. I think it's less about, I think this is a reaction, which is like, what does this current thing mean? Which of course means all stuff around reporting requirements, etc., etc. But also I think there's a sensation that like this could continue for every half a year in terms of new legislation for the next 1 year, next 4 years. And I think a lot of funds, the interesting thing is that it covers obviously private investments, right? And these private investments takes a long time, right? So they take 5 years for the private equity at least, right? 10, 12, 15 for venture capital. And so that time horizon basically means that you can't be thinking about the legislation today, but you think about what the legislation climate would be in the next 10 years. And so you already have to take the worst case scenario of this, otherwise you can't exit. One other thing I think about as well is about what it means for Southeast Asia as well. So I think one thing that we notice obviously is that this means that there's going to be less investments from the US, for example, into China. I think the EU in the article says that they are also considering doing the same. But I think what's interesting, of course, is that they used to diversify in China. And so now they have to diversify in other countries, right? And I think that Southeast Asia may receive some net inflows, I guess, from this.
Yeah. I
Because
mean,
they're still
I don't know
yeah.
how much, but also, where do you
Yeah.
think are the semiconductor, quantum computing, and AI
Yeah.
work being done, right? I think probably South Korea, Japan,
Yeah.
Taiwan. We
Yeah.
do actually have a quantum computing center in Singapore that's doing
Right.
really interesting work. But I think another consequence, maybe you might see more Chinese companies headquartering in Singapore, trying to
Yeah. I
sort
think
of
so too.
shed, their Chinese or separating out entities and having sort of a Singapore based entity that is cleaner for investing.
I think we've already seen this strategy before, right? For example, there are countries in Southeast Asia where, there's a lot of textiles. And so, there's been a big push for textiles to be pushed out of China. And so for various reasons, right? And then as a result, I think Chinese companies have been moving their capital, that's one, but also their management, and set up factories, right, in Southeast Asian country in order to be able to continue exporting under the supply chain. So I think there's an interesting dynamic where, it has happened in other industries, but I think this will happen a lot for tech folk. I mean, obviously, I think the other part of it is just like, it's not just a push factor, but also there's a pull factor. I was talking to, a Chinese entrepreneur to be, I mean, the person was thinking from their perspective was like, I think of the Chinese tech crackdown, and actually had known somebody who unfortunately had gone to jail. And it was like, hey, if I choose to build a business, do I want to build this in China or do I want to build this in Singapore, right? And so I think there's a little bit of that factor where they were like, well, over a 10-year game, we don't know what the legislation within China is going to look like. But of course, I think a lot of entrepreneurs who are coming to Singapore obviously then struggle in terms of like the right networks, the right entry point, the right conversation to have, the right markets to go after. So I think there's a big issue. Yeah.
Well, and also, I think cost, right? I think Singapore is a pretty expensive place to do business. And so I think there's this just like net great thing. You're like, hey, more talent is coming in, more investment is coming.
Right.
You're like, but it's really expensive to do business here. It's also a small country.
Right.
It's hard to hire. And so
Right.
how do you kind of navigate that? Which is
Right.
something I think is a really interesting one. I kind of make the joke like, hey, hurry up and build the MRT to JB. Then, you can relieve some of the housing pressure.
It's supposedly 40% complete. So
Is it?
fingers crossed. Yeah, the RTS.
No, but I actually think that would be amazing, right? It's like Oakland and San Francisco. Like you could actually have a ton more people live in JB. And if they had
Yeah.
easy commute access to Singapore, that actually would benefit both countries.
Yeah, 100%. It makes a lot of sense. And that train link has gone through. I read the Wikipedia this last week and I was like, yeah, it's gone through a lot of ups and downs. So I'm glad at least the Singapore to Johor Bahru link is still going on. Like
too far. Too hard to do.
I was still looking forward to that one, actually, to be honest.
I mean, that would be amazing, but I mean,
That would be
there's other
amazing.
things. Yeah, but I think this topic of like, hey, once you land in Singapore, like, where do you start? How do you get plugged in and, start getting connected to the community? And I think one challenge
Right.
about Singapore is it can feel incredibly siloed. So you can
Right.
have, very robust communities but they're all separated from each other and don't necessarily all talk to each other. And all of them run on WhatsApp. It's not like there's like a
Right.
website where you're like, hey, how do I find out about stuff? You sort of slowly meet people and they're like, I'll add you to a WhatsApp. And then once you get into the WhatsApp, it's like, oh, all this stuff is happening. Who knew?
Right.
And so, I think there's like the China Chinese, the Indian, the local Chinese, the Rocket alumni, the European refugee. There's just so many different vertical groups of people.
Right.
And I really hope, we can make a way for them to like come together and share ideas. Cause I think that's actually how we come up with a more robust ecosystem.
Right.
But I guess, Jeremy, like, what advice would you give someone? I've decided, okay, I'm going to start my next venture. I'm going to base it in Singapore so that I can future-proof myself for the next 10 years.
Right.
Where do I get started?
Well, I think I'd love to jump to obviously the professional side, but I think the most important thing is really get situated yourself in Singapore, right? I guess today's episode is all about Singapore. But I think if you're moving to Singapore, I think you just have to make sure that you really understand Singapore as a country, but also I think Southeast Asia history, right? In the country. Because I think if you look at Singapore as just a whole country, there's a lot of like parameters and I don't know, from your past country, whatever it is, that you may just kind of like bring in and you just have all these assumptions, right? But for example, like Southeast Asia, Singapore is a big story within Southeast Asia for thousands of years in terms of trade. I was just reading this fun history bit about one of the old reports of Singapore, right, in the 1800s. And then some British guy was like, oh, I've visited Singapore. It's such a bustling port. He has sucked up all the trade from Batavia. Basically the power of free enterprise and low taxation. I'll put a link there. I didn't make this up, but Batavia is the old name for Jakarta, right?
Well, you also do the funny accent because that'll be great.
That'd be great. That was my best British accent. Hoity-toity. Anyway, but I think the point of it, just trying to say here is like, I think the big part of it is just like, are you in Singapore for 5 years? Are you just to try it out? Or are you here for a long time, right? Because I think there's a lot of stories about whether you're doing a short-term game or a long-term game, right? I think if you're doing a short-term game where you're going to be here for 5 years, then you think carefully, right? Am I going to be an operator? Am I going to be an employee? I mean, you do things very differently, right? And like you said, if you want to be part of an expatriate or other hobby or identity community, it's not really a problem, right? If you're just here for 5 years. But if you're planning to be around for a long 10, 20, 30, 40, there's a great channel, right, by Max Chernoff, which, profiles, immigrants to Singapore who have been here for a long time. Then I think the conversations about how you want to integrate and who you want to have conversations with and how you want to kind of like join the culture in that sense is very different. I think that's really important because if you don't have your personal and family stuff situated, you can't really even get started on your professional side, right? And it changes the type of relationships you want to build on a professional side. So those are my thoughts initially. What's your initial advice to someone coming in?
Oh gosh, mine wasn't so profound. I think mine was much more tactical.
Oh, go for it. Why not?
I mean, I think like Singapore is a small place. And so, you just start with one conversation and, people will introduce you to other people. And I think I would start with like first leverage, the networks you do have, right? So whether it's your school networks, your professional networks, like take that and parlay that into more conversations to build up your
Right.
picture of what's going on. But I think related to your thing about the personal is I think you have to find ways to build community for yourself.
Right.
And so when we first moved back, even though I grew up in Singapore, I hadn't lived in Singapore for 20 years. So in some sense, like I actually had to start from scratch.
Yeah.
And what we did was we just had dinner with like the two other people we knew who worked in tech in Singapore. And we're like, bring a friend. So you sort of, started with like a dinner group of 6 people. And we sort of started that as a way to like get to know people in a more intimate setting and then kind of steadily built outwards from there. So everyone we met was kind of like referred in from that initial group of like 4 people. And that was actually a great organic way to kind of keep meeting people, but also keep touch points with a consistent group of people over time. And it's something that I tell people about and I recommend that they do for themselves because there is quite a lot of flow in Singapore. I do think that people are pretty open to meeting new people, but people are also kind of allergic to the idea of networking. And so I think smaller group settings actually foster like more openness and sharing and can help you feel more comfortable and situated in a place. So you're not kind of like just like your job and your apartment. If you kind of want to build more around that. But I think getting into some of these WhatsApp groups, which you will get put into, and then following up with people once they're like, hey, there's an event happening, or I'm working on this, or whatever it is. I think those are great ways to kind of just start getting plugged in.
Right.
And then, of course, listening to our podcast.
Go hit up Shiyan. Go hit up Jeremy. That's the key advice is the headline is. There we go.
Well, Jeremy runs a great community, associated with the podcast, and I think it attracts like-minded people. But I mean, I think that's like something that's like pretty different, right? Is that this whole place runs on WhatsApp groups.
Yeah, I do think one thing is that what struck me about it was a conversation about Singapore being small. But I think the inverse way to look at it as well is that it's also very dense. I think density is also important for serendipity, right? So I was walking out of work and I saw Bohan Balani at E27. He was like locked in, right, into his like headphones, and I'm just like, I started dancing in front of him. It's like, what? Who is this stranger weirdo dancing in front of me? Because it's just like, he's not paying attention, right? And then I was like, hey. And then he was like, oh. And he himself was like, oh, that's so funny. I just ran into you because I was at a coffee shop, met 2 founders separately by accident. We just said hi. I do think about that quite a bit because I think maximizing serendipity is really, really important because obviously there's the intentional networking that you talked about, right? Conversations and so forth. But serendipity, luck of meeting the right person is often a big part of it, but you need to have density to make it really happen at that reaction, right? Another founder that I met who had traveled in was like, wow, one interesting thing about Singapore is like, he was just saying like, I have all these meetings with people back to back, and everybody's on the same place and I can have conversations in the same day back home. I'm just kind of like, stuck in traffic or whatever it is, right? So the density of that rate of introduction is actually slower, right, from his perspective. So I think there's something that's a plus, but I think there's something that you do have to, once you get into the flow, like you said, I think you get that density sensation. But otherwise, it feels a bit hard to cross the hurdle.
Yeah, for sure.
I would get a point about the returning. I mean, I think turtles, they call it, right? Pioneer in China, but I think the concept of like folks returning to their home countries across Southeast Asia is quite a common one, right? And I think there's this phrase I always loved. It's called like culture re-entry shock. So it's like culture shock. When you enter a new culture, you get culture shock. But actually, there's something called re-entry, which is phase, which means that you were from that culture and then you went there and you came back and then it's okay to have culture shock, right? So I was like, yeah, this is a good way to describe it because for myself, I came back a couple of years ago as well, right?
What was the biggest re-entry shock?
Well, couple of the fact that it was a pandemic that kind of kicked in real soon after. But I think the big difference for me was information opacity was kind of really real. So what I mean by that is just like when I was in Boston, New York, I think whenever you're working with founders or VCs, I think there's a lot of this being being freely shared about A, B, C. But I think, within Southeast Asia, there's like three parts, right? One is, I think the ecosystem is good, right? So, people are not like, don't volunteer as much information, I would say. So I think that's one big piece. The second part of it is, I think there's also the fact that there's actually a silo between ecosystems, right? So if you're in Indonesia, obviously understanding the Singapore ecosystem is more opaque versus, Singapore to Indonesia is like what? Singapore to like San Francisco to New York, right? There's a little bit easier flow. And then thirdly, of course, I think it's opacity around certain verticals because everyone's just figuring it out. It's like, we don't understand what supply chain is. We don't understand what Rarong tech is. We don't understand what local fintech is. So everyone's still figuring it out, which is okay. But I think there's an interesting dynamic where I think it felt like there was that ramp of information, right? Especially like if you go to Substack these days, right? Or Twitter, it's like all full of information about America. How much information is there about Southeast Asia that you can read online?
It's a good point, and I wonder why. I mean, I think founders are generally more reticent in region.
Yeah.
I would say.
Right.
I had a founder conversation yesterday and he was like, who do I ask this question to? Like, I wouldn't ask my investors this. And I'm like, hey man, I'm sitting right here.
Mwah. That's my
And
French
he's like,
accent. Mwah.
no. He's like, okay, you're okay. But basically the sentiment behind it was, I think, like, he didn't really want to show weakness to his investors, like that he didn't know something.
Yeah.
And I get it, but also I think that's something we want to change. I think we want people to ask for help more.
Right.
And like you said, everyone is figuring it out. It is okay not to know. In fact, it is normal not to know. Right. And you're going to know faster by asking than pretending you know. And we should be open about helping each other kind of progress.
Well, I mean, information asymmetry is, an edge, right? And I think that's the rationale, I think, for that's one. And then also power distance is a real sensation in Southeast Asia. So I think there's a little bit more of a power distance between one stack to the other stack, right? So I think we have those two things combined together. I think it's quite common for folks to feel like, hey, if I share, it's going to be with my friends, right? People who I really trust. Free flow, right? Because I think when you have an ecosystem that has more information transparency, one of the benefits obviously benefits new founders and it benefits the founder ecosystem, which includes more mature, sophisticated founders as well. And it also benefits VCs, right? Because people are trying to figure it out. But in the short term, information asymmetry benefits incumbents. It benefits founders who have kind of like cracked it to some extent, right? And they don't want to share what the secret sauce is to everybody.
I guess so, but like, I think I don't really believe in secret sauce, maybe.
Ooh.
Which is that I think ideas are cheap.
Yeah.
And just because someone told you how to do something doesn't actually mean you can do it.
Sure.
And if you can, then it's not really secret sauce. Like that's just like by definition, right? So like, I actually think there's very little downside to sharing like what you do because it's like, hey, if somebody can replicate it, power to them, but also like that's not a real edge. It actually has to be something that you uniquely are capable of doing. And that's actually how you build operating leverage, right? It's something that you're uniquely capable of doing. And so I hear what you're saying, but I disagree because this is like when people are like, it's in stealth and I need you to sign an NDA. And it's like, come on, man. No, I'm not signing an NDA. And like, whatever you think is a secret thing, like you actually would make more progress faster if you told people what you're doing.
I think to add to that, I think there is a small risk, but it is to put a bit of nuance there. I think the benefits of sharing is more important than the risk. So I think if there's a risk that somebody might go out there and clone it or localize it and so forth or borrow it, I think that's fair. So I just think that when you're in Southeast Asia or any startup you're building, like you need to rally people, right? You need to rally as much, support, capital as possible. And that kind of goes back to the serendipity piece as well, right? It's like if everything's closed, everything's a secret, you can't have any space for serendipity at all because nobody knows they can help you, right?
Yeah, but like that's the thing, right? Which is like we need to get more comfortable with sharing imperfect things, works in progress. Not everything is shiny and perfect. In fact, most things are not. And that's like how we actually progress as an ecosystem. We actually have to like, here's what I got. I think it sort of works. I'm struggling with this thing. Can you help me? And then that's, that's how we're going to progress together. But like, I think that's a point that we're still immature in this ecosystem is we want perfection. And we also like to like exalt people too early, I think. Like to hold them up and be like, look, this is a paragon of entrepreneurship.
But this was those the best stories. I love them too. And I was also the beneficiary of these stories as well, right? I was a founder twice. And I benefited a lot from, the media putting me on a pedestal early. Because if not, I mean, I always remember like my mom like hated whatever I was doing until one day I brought back a Straits Times article to my face and my co-founder. And she was like, oh, I get it now. Anyway, I mean, I think it's, media looking for good, positive stories. I think they should spotlight some stories.
Yeah, we should. But I think it's like, what do we say about that person, right? Like we don't.
I think we shouldn't say that they solved it.
Yeah.
I think that's the most important thing, I think. I think we can say they're working very hard. We respect them for the determination. They took on a bunch of risk that other people don't want to do, and they figured out some level of execution that has gotten them to the point where we think that we should feature them because it's not just team and capital and
It's the
approach.
Singapore story, Jeremy. There was a time when people said that Singapore wouldn't make it, but we did.
That was exactly the song they played at the kindergarten, but had a kid singing it. And I was like, oh my God, like all my nationalism cells are exploding and vibrating in harmony right now. That's how they get you, right? Yeah, but I think that's the crux of it, right? Is like every ecosystem has to figure out like, how do you say someone is a hero for the effort, but not a hero because of their results, right? Because if you're Series B, you still haven't solved it, to be honest, right? So.
Yeah, and also the focus on funding raised, I think, makes people think about the wrong set of goalposts.
Well, yeah.
I mean, I tell everyone, did you start a company to raise money or to make money?
Yeah. But, it shows that you got picked by a gatekeeper, right? Of capital, right? It shoes that you kind of like cleared a level of market authentication verification as a signal. This is a quality team, right? That's why.
Yeah, but I think I think that's also like challenging because, people always ask me this question. It's like, well, what do investors want to see? And I always say, well, let's forget about investors for a second. Like, what do you want to see?
Right.
You have incredible opportunity cost in pursuing this business. Like, what do you want to see in your business that gives you confidence that you've de-risked it to spend another 5 years of your life on it? Right. I think that's like a more important conversation to have instead of seeking this sort of, external validation, which, let's face it, right, investors are wrong a lot.
Yeah.
Right. But their models account for that. Their models account for being wrong a lot and hopefully being really right a couple times.
Yeah. 18 out of 20 times can be wrong. On that note, any parting words that you want to say? With your kid kind of like sidling back in, trying to be the star. There you go.
No, I mean, I think I'm incredibly optimistic about this ecosystem, right? I think there's a lot of macro stuff that is really pushing us along that I don't think we could have imagined 5 years ago.
Yeah, I agree.
Some of it is geopolitical, but I think in terms of like what we as an ecosystem can do to help move it along further, I think there's this sort of notion around like information exchange, community building, like helping each other, I think is really important. And so would want to encourage people to do that, to connect more, create more moments of this serendipity. And then, we can all prosper together or something. Can you do it? What was it? Live long and prosper. How do you do that?
Live long and prosper. No, come on. You didn't do it right.
Well, I quit one. I don't know the game around it.
It's not okay. So you biologically cannot do the Star Trek. Okay, got it. Signed. Rather than the fact that you totally butchered it. Okay, all right.
I'm sorry. Did I offend your Trekkie sensibilities?
More of a Star Wars guy, but I do enjoy watching some Star Trek stuff. I think my parting words is, 10 years ago, like you said, it's a story, right? And 10 years ago, it was pretty much very difficult. And now today, we think it's possible, but we still think it's very difficult. 10 years time, I think it will get easier. And I think people still think it's difficult. 10 years, it will always be difficult.
No, starting a company is always difficult. There's no way around that.
No way around that. But I just think that the ecosystem is definitely becoming more mature across not just Singapore, but Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam. So I think it's an interesting dynamic where I think we just go step by step. So lets you do some really crazy stuff, stay for the long term, right? And wait for system mature. On that note, thank you so much, Shiyan, and see you next week. Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.